The question to all of you is, we sit here because some or many of us, or only few, have the impression something is going wrong because we don't have as many pediatric trials as we expected with the pediatric regulation. So I would like to know also from different stakeholders, also sponsors, maybe investigators, what are the problems, the obstacles, the issues you face once you have a PIP and you want to implement it and do trials? Daniel? Yes, please.
Can you switch off your mic, please? Yeah.
Thank you, Francis Squally. I'm here on behalf of the European Academy of Pediatrics.
Okay.
My question is, I think sometimes for us on ethics committees, one of the challenges is, with regard to pediatric trials, is that the PIP has already been submitted and more or less approved by the EMA. And then afterwards, the individual trial protocols come to us. And I think this makes it difficult and puts probably the PEDCO as well as the ethics committees in a bit of a tight situation with regard to reviewing trial designs and so forth that are already reviewed by PEDCO or already in a preliminary way foreseen that way. So I think this is one of the challenges that we have.
Yes, please, Daniel.
No, I agree with you on one hand that a PIP is a provisional program. And at the time when it is drafted and agreed with the sponsor, of course, it's kind of a risk-benefit ratio. The benefit is, as in the legislation, the anticipated benefit that we presume that drug would deliver. Don't forget there is about 60% attrition rate anyway in the development. And the risk being, looking at a potential waiver, should we grant a waiver for a drug likely not to be safe or likely not to be efficient. Of course, if we would be in a very negative mood, we could, in this respect, waive probably everything. And that's not the purpose of the legislation. That's not what the driver. It's the opposite. We are at the time of drafting a PIP at a very early stage. We try to catch an opportunity. And indeed, we are presuming that a potential program could make it. And answering the question from José Cosvacé, indeed, there are a lot of uncertainties. These uncertainties are, should all these clinical trials in children be conducted? And that's the adaptation. That's on a rolling base that companies should come back for requests of modifications. But that's also a plea that whenever an ethical committee is looking at one single study, salami sliced, from the program, probably they should go back and have the full overview. Does this clinical trial, both on an ethical and scientific point of view, still make sense in the program when at the time when it was indeed anticipated and drafted? And that's the difficulty. That's we need to discuss all together here, have a strong coordination to make sure that, with time evolving, still the development is the best adequate.
Okay, Ines, next.
Sorry, I had my chance, but I just had this idea that we talk all about trials in medicine now, of course, because we're at the EMA. But what worries me is trials with children, with surgical procedures, with all kinds of new diagnostic procedures, because despite the bureaucracy this may bring, on the other hand, you know that it will be looked into very carefully and with lots of scrutiny, which may not be the case for all kinds of other trials. And I was wondering whether we could in some way contribute to those trials also being looked at very carefully. It's like the other groups that are out of the debates. Often also this whole area of medical research is not getting enough attention.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, I'm wondering why when we receive clinical trials to be examined by ethics committee, we don't receive the PIP. We don't know where the clinical trial is among the PIP, and I think there should be an element of what ethics committee should examine.
Please.
Just if I may, it's the same problem for the national competent authorities.
Okay.
They authorize the trial.
Yeah.
Yeah. To put maybe the problem a little bit on the ethical aspects, we have a quandary for us because the applications are driven by the adult market. Industry developed medicine mostly for adults, and this is driven by large markets, large indications. Still, we're talking about personalized medicine, but still the majority is for large markets. So what we see doesn't necessarily meet the pediatric needs, and we have to adapt within that adult market, what could be the potential pediatric use. So we find ourselves with a application that may not come at the right time, maybe multiple, we have many Me Too's, because industries come also with waves of products, very similar product. So the committee is in front of the choice, but doesn't know what the extent of the choice. We see one product, then next month we'll see 2 products, and next month we'll see 3 products. What is the best one? What is the best candidate? We have no vision of the future. We cannot decide, and we don't know the data in adult at that stage. So it is difficult to choose which, say, we will only ask for one pediatric investigation plan and one series of trials. There is also competition for the very few patients that can be available. So there are a lot of ethical issues that the pediatric committee has to face when deciding. So far, the principle is that we treat every company the same way. We also know that the legal requirement or the regulatory requirement for demonstration may not meet the direct benefit. Why do you demonstrate that certain products are effective versus placebo when we know that the Me Too's have been effective and we have already 2? Is 2 enough? We may miss the 3rd one, which could be a progress. Not all Me Too's are equivalent. So we have a number of things that are driven by the way the medicines are currently developed in the world, not just in Europe, and that are really putting additional ethical problems to the committee.
Thank you. Klaus Rose?
In the last session, there was a comment made by Professor, I didn't catch his name, but I'm sure he was the professor on my side.
Hasford.
Professor Hasford. And that was the example of multiple intramuscular injections for placebo purposes. I think that is a perfect example of a proposal that is deeply and completely unethical and should be rejected by every ethics committee in children. But why I pick that up is industry is often in a situation where we have very enthusiastic counterparts in FDA, in EMA, in the pediatric committee. And some of their requests we receive as exaggerated. So one key element of the ethics committee's functions is that they help us to document that some of the pediatric committees or FDA's or any other agency's requests are just not acceptable. Because with that, we can go back and document that ethics committees have not accepted. So unfortunately, ethics committees, as other partners in this negotiation, they never can make everybody happy, because there are some reasons we dislike the rejection of a protocol by an ethics committee, but in other cases it helps as a element of reality and to reject requests from authorities. So I think this is a conflict. There is no perfect solution for it. What I would hope in the future is that rejections are made when it's absolutely unethical, and that the additional education of ethics committee will help to accept those trials where their comments are less important.
Thank you. Now it's Robert Nelson.
Thank you. Just a comment in response to Klaus's claim that any use of an invasive placebo would be unethical. I'll tell you a story. In 1992, I'm Robert Nelson. I'm the senior pediatric ethicist at the Food and Drug Administration. We actually have 2 ethicists in pediatrics at the Food and Drug Administration. There was a trial that was proposed in 1992 for testing growth hormone for short stature in children with Noonan's syndrome. And to do that required a invasive placebo. There was some argument about impacts of injections on growth hormone, as well as concerns about evaluation, etc. That trial was, I think, weekly injections for over 2 years, and could have even been longer. Ethics review committees in the United States struggled with that, even in spite of our having the category of a minor increase over minimal risk. It was referred to a federal panel that was made up of august scientists and ethicists, many of whom are still actively involved in pediatric ethics in the United States today, and that panel could not agree. They did not come to an agreement about whether they thought that was ethical or not, with some saying it fit into this minor increase over minimal risk and others saying it didn't. So what do I do with that? When I'm asked about that question at the FDA, for example, in multiple sclerosis, where now you have, can we use MRI scan or not? Does that correlate with clinical outcome? Or given that you now have oral medications as well as IM medications, do you do a double dummy with an oral against an IM? What I generally tell the division is, I can't say that's unethical because I had a federal panel of august ethicists say that they couldn't decide. But I'm sure when that goes to many ethics committees that many will say it's unethical. So it's a complex problem. So we all have very strong opinions. That's, I guess, the point of my story, but it's not clear to me that there's only one right answer.
Thank you. Timothy Chambers?
Agnes made a very interesting point just now about the cast of mind of developing pharmaceutical products. I would take the view that pharmaceutical products would be developed for the whole of humankind, whatever age. We'll take the broad view, and then they must be tailored to the various different circumstances. Whereas if we still continue to think they are fundamentally for adults and that children are a bolt-on, then we're going to get stuck.
Thank you. It's Ines then.
I think it's very important what you mentioned, that ethics is work in progress, that it's not written in stone, and that we also in the committees are developing ethical interpretations, and that's why it's so important to share it. But I was actually going to comment on the idea of refusing all trials. It's my experience that very often that is not necessary, but that you can ask to minimize risks and burdens, and there is a lot of minimizing possible if one has the choice of not going through with the trial or minimizing. It's amazing what can be taken out of trials and still make them scientifically valid. So I think that's a better strategy than the whole refusal.
Yeah.
The problem here is if you have a multi-center trial with 50 centers around the globe, and then you discuss with 50 ethics committees who want different minimizing risk strategies, the trial will not take place. That is the problem with multi-center trials.
Dr. Hasford?
Yeah, thank you. Coming back to this, I don't like to have here a kind of ghost or virtual discussion. I would like to know how many research applications are actually rejected by ethics committees. We, I think, in Germany have a constitutional right of the freedom of research, and it's very highly respected. So, and we have surveys within our 53 ethics committee, research ethics committee, and it seems that very, very few research applications are actually rejected, in particular within the drug trials field. Very, very few. I think probably less than 10 or so. So I don't know how the situation is in other European countries, but rejections are the absolute exception. It's also true that passing in the first round is also very rare. I think 98% of the trials get modifications, mainly in the informed consent area. So, having said that, I think I completely agree what you said from the United States. It's sometimes not so clear that there's one best way. I also realize that I'm a clinical trialist by background, but here I'm as a person who represents ethics committees. So as a trialist, I know that placebo is preferable from many points of view and for many reasons. So the closer you are to a drug authority, the more you are inclined to accept placebo-controlled trials. But the more you are going in the direction of ethics committees, the more problematic it is. I do not know of any trial in Germany that has been rejected by the drug authority by having a placebo control. There may be one, but I don't know, and I have never experienced that. But for ethics committees, and I wanted to have the same example like you with regard to multiple sclerosis. I think there are now a couple of drugs have been approved by the drug authorities. It's a partly irreversible disease, so where is the legitimacy for having a placebo control in that trial? And I think that's a very serious problem, and there we have a lot of discussions, and I have to say, not enough discussion. One has to look for other ways. And interestingly, for example, the American Neurological Society has made proposals how to solve that in an ethical method. I will not go into detail for that, but that proposal, although it has been published a couple of years ago, seems to have not been accepted partly by the sponsors and so on. So I think there are serious problems, and but we really try to get the trials acceptable and also fulfilling our task as protecting that we have to protect that in the law, so to speak, that we have to protect the patient's interests. And that should be not forgotten. We have a very strict mission statement by the government and by the parliaments to protect the interests of the patients. Not the interests of the pharmaceutical industry, not the interests of a European or global harmonization. That's all not in the law. And we are forced to comply with the German law.
Agnes?
Yeah, I actually believe that the law is actually pushing for harmonization, but a European law, which also applies to Germany for the time being, as long as we are in the Eurozone. But sorry, I'm joking. No, sorry, I didn't want to be unrespectful. I think you made a very important point, and actually I share your views, and I think it's very important to see that the ethics committee and the regulators seem to disagree. Actually, we have a lot of discussion at the regulators' end on the use of placebo, and in particular in multiple sclerosis there has been endless discussion on whether an active comparator would be better because we already have a product. There are two things that are important to remember, that we need, for ethical reasons, we need a valid demonstration of the activity of the product, of the efficacy. And the fact that you use an active comparator may jeopardize the validity of the comparison, and therefore makes all the use of the patient unethical, because you will not be able to conclude. We all know that non-inferiority trial, which is the alternative to the placebo control of the with superiority, is actually raising a lot of issues and making it more difficult to show activity. So that is why it is not an easy decision. I'm not saying there is a right or wrong decision. I'm just saying it's not an easy decision, because if at the end we cannot conclude, we are also unethical. And it is important that we try to understand each other's, because the same people may be in two different situations taking two different decisions depending on where they are, which I think is an interesting situation.
Thank you. First, Robert Nelson again.
Hey, thank you. I just wanted to make one clarification. My use of multiple sclerosis as an example was to illustrate that even if you did an active comparator trial, and not necessarily a placebo trial, that when you have an oral medication and an IM medication and did a double dummy design, you're stuck with needing to give someone an IM injection of a placebo, even if you do an active comparator trial. So I was not necessarily using that example to advocate for placebo.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Yes, Bartha Maria Knoppers from McGill University. I was struck in the presentation of the data from the 3 years of pediatric regulation in the European Union of some of the conditions, the neglected areas, as well as the difference between the age groups of children that are included or excluded, simply perhaps because of the ethical difficulties of including younger children or children with certain conditions. And the example that comes to mind that I went through in front of an ethics committee myself had to do with Duchene, as was brought up in the presentation by Inez, where the proposal was to do myoblast injection into the muscles of young children suffering from Duchene with a form of a genetic vector. But it wasn't the genetic part that actually disturbed the ethics committee. The province of Quebec, being a civil law jurisdiction, but nevertheless does have both a direct and possibility of indirect benefit to children of like age or like condition. So it's broader than the direct benefit rule. It was rejected simply because it had not been done on adults first, which is a Helsinki Declaration requirement. Nevertheless, as most people know, these are the conditions where pediatric conditions that are particular to children, often the children don't live to the adult age where you can do the necessary trials to show improvement in muscle growth and elasticity. And so because there had not been, and the committee insisted it had been done on 18-year-olds, by which time the researcher opined it would no longer be of any value, so you get caught in this catch-22 of protectionism under what seemingly seemed as a wide margin of appreciation, and yet refusal to recognize the particularities of certain pediatric conditions.
Okay, thank you. Is there somebody who wants to respond to this comment directly? Klaus Rose, please.
There's a multitude of conditions and diseases that predominantly are child diseases, and they exist also in adults, such as atopic dermatitis. And we have there already a precedence that in the US, one atopic dermatitis product was approved with pivotal trials performed in children. And then they allowed the extrapolation of these data into adults. So I think this is just an example. And there are others. If you have neurodegenerative diseases, you want to test them in adults first. These adults are destroyed already. They may even live, but the damage is done. So to insist that the drug should then only first be investigated in adults means to condemn the children to become crippled. So this is a good example where we can say that the ethics is definitely on the side to allow children to be included into the trial, to allow them the chance to have the damage minimized.
Okay, I have a question myself to what you said. Now, couldn't the investigators and the sponsor talk to the research ethics committee and explain the specific situation in this disease and trial? Was it a lack of knowledge or a bad composition of the committee?
Probably all of the above. Having been there myself, I'm professor of children in the law and so on, and I can tell you that it was fear from the hospital, the institution in which where the research was going to be done, of potential bad press and potential legal liability.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Sam Maldonado from Johnson & Johnson. I think this forum is very good in which you bring regulators and ethics committees, but sometimes in what we found ourselves in industry is trying to convince the ethics committee that the request by regulators, even if it includes invasive procedures, is appropriate given the particular disease and the need of the invasive procedure to actually add in the certainty of the diagnosis. Or we find ourselves in the opposite way, trying to convince the regulators that the ethics committee has a reason when they don't want to allow these procedures to go forward. So we, as I said, in industry, find sometimes ourselves in the middle, trying to be the advocate for one or the other. Is there a way in which regulators actually talk directly to the ethics committee, so minimizing this middle position in which we find ourselves? Because it's sometimes people perceive that we in industry have such an interest, but if the regulators talk directly with the ethics committee, maybe that will help also alleviate some of these wondering which we find ourselves.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have the same impression that the sponsors sit in the middle and must play the mediator between the authorities and the research ethics committees very often. So my next question would have been, how could there be more collaboration between authorities, pediatric committee and ethics committees? Are there suggestions? For example, an ethics committee often never sees a pediatric investigational plan, as was suggested before. Often, I think committee members don't know what the PIP is and what the pediatric committee is. So are there suggestions how this collaboration could be better so that not the sponsors have to play the mediator? Please.
Peter Helms. In that particular question you asked, I mean, there seem to be three components here. We've got the regulator ethics committee, and actually we've got industry, of course, but we've also got the trialists and the clinicians themselves, those individuals who do the studies and collect the patients and know the clinical condition intimately. It seems that in ethic committee applications, it's industry that has the relationship with the trialists, gets the information that's required, and then presents it. And there are clearly different camps here. And we tend to work in complete separate identities, although there's a lot of individuals who have who come from those three different camps, who are on either regulatory body, advising industry as experts, and those involved in the clinical networks that have the patients and access to them. It seems to me that one way of dealing with this issue, we've all learnt a lot today. We've learnt a lot from each other, from different aspects, from the ethics side of it, a bit from industry, a bit from regulators. And the more we talk and share these issues and challenges, we've also heard some very high-level ethics considerations from opinion leaders and experts and ethicists about how autonomy and decision-making and views on this are evolving in different aspects, legal aspects that can be that can be presented. But it seems to me the model which this agent, with the European agency, has adopted for promoting clinical trials and getting access to the patient population through things like EMPRIMA, the network of pediatric research groups and networks in Europe, could equally be done in an ethical framework by having some kind of European structure for discussion, networking between ethics committees and regulators in an informal sense. I know that you can't do this formally because you have different functions, but to understand more each other's problems and to try and develop some more harmonization across Europe, because there are clearly very different attitudes and interpretations across Europe. There's something like that. Maybe we'll come to that tomorrow when we look at outcomes. But I would have thought that would be a very good, important first step, because we're learning so much at this particular meeting, but it needs to be distributed more widely.
Thank you. First, Agnes, did you? Oh, okay, Daniel.
No, a short comment to that, because indeed industry is sitting in the middle, but industry could also act in the middle, because I'm back again amazed to see that also at the side of the national competent authority, the clinical trials are often submitted without any statement that they are part of a PIP, and having, the advantage to sitting both sides. I recognize a trial as being part of a, of a PIP, but no mention of it. So I think, if all of us would do an effort of communication so that those assessing could have or see it in perspective.
Yes, please. First here at the right and then left.
Just to respond to your question with a question, to what extent would it be possible for the PIPs to be shared with the ethics committees, either through the sponsor themselves or through another mechanism?
Do you want to answer directly and then later the gentleman?
I will answer directly. At this stage, the PIPs, i.e. the assessment of the proposal by the company and the final agreement is still considered confidential and is with the company. So the sponsor could submit it, but we cannot directly send it to the ethics committee. We are publishing on a summary of the content of the PIP. We intend to increase the transparency. Personally, I would go for full transparency, but I am not the one deciding completely. I try to influence, but I'm not deciding. And so I think the future is for more transparency, and I hope that will also resolve some of the ethical issues.
If I could just wanted to say, because I think it would help the ethics committee if they could see the individual protocol in the context of the larger.
Oh, they can and should request it from the sponsor, as I understand?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Please.
Okay, sorry. Ronald de Groot, National Medical Ethical Committee, Netherlands. Ines this morning proposed two issues. One, a national approach, and secondly, a strict scientific evaluation of the protocols. If we look to the situation in the Netherlands, we have approximately 100 projects per year in all 23 medical ethical committees, which are either drug-related or intervention-related. Now, if we would spread that over 23 medical ethical committees, that would be, say, 4, but it will obviously, for many committees, be less, even 1 case per year. And it's impossible to actually give this expertise, even from, at a lower level than what we discuss here, to those committees. So this all moves in the direction, I think, of a country-wide approach with maybe, 2 or 3 additional pediatric chambers in medical ethical committees in order to make sure that the kind of communication which we have here reaches the field. Second issue is in terms of the scientific content. It will be tremendously difficult to find pediatricians who are so broad-based that they can evaluate at the same time translational research issues, clinical research issues, neonatology, oncology, etc. So this again shows that in all of our countries, I think, we have a very limited number of persons who are able to do this. On top of that, are they going to do this if they are asked to actually sit in the medical ethical committees? Because what we see in the Netherlands is that increasingly pretty junior people are proposed to come into the medical ethical committees because the senior people are too busy to do the science and they don't want to be involved in the very extensive process of evaluating projects. So what I would propose is that we really discuss the evaluation at the national level or at a very limited number of research committees.
Okay, so fewer ethics committees and ethics committees with more knowledge of pediatric trials. That's your suggestion?
Yes, because also there it would be interesting actually to do some comparison between different countries, showing them or giving them the same protocol. I'm very sure that in terms of clinical pharmacy and pharmacology, evaluation is more or less standardized in most of our countries, but there are huge differences in terms of presence of methodologists in the committees and in terms of the evaluation of the scientific content of the projects. So those are issues to be covered, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, in the back.
Yeah, my name is Berg from Bonn, Germany, and I'm representing a project which is funded by the European Commission, which started in spring this year. And the aim of this network project is exactly to bring together research ethics committees from across Europe. So ideally, this is supposed to be a platform which could be a counterpart for regulators like EMA. But actually one problem we are facing is that the situation of ethics committees across Europe is very different, very diverse. So we are focusing on national associations of ethics committees. So in order not to have hundreds of people there, but ideally 27 or so. But at present, many countries don't have national associations. So hopefully, if we are successful, we will bring together more ethics committees, associations, and stimulate those countries which do not have such an association by now in, let's say, the next 2 years to found something. So probably there could be a counterpart to discuss ethical issues between regulatory authorities and ethics committees on a European level.
Thank you very much. I think that is a good suggestion for logistics to get to the goal that we can talk between authorities and ethics committees, because the authorities can't talk to each committee. So in the countries themselves, they have to establish a sort of networking and have a head committee which feels responsible for their committees in that country, and then the authorities can start communication with these. Please, last remark, and then we finish the session.
Some of the data that we saw this morning, there was a request from, or plea perhaps, from ethics committees for more training. And I think there is a lot of mea culpa on the part of universities in terms of how they train today's generation of bioethicists who formerly came through practical routes to experience, to sitting on these committees, but who now are frequently fully trained PhD bioethicists. But if you look at the course materials and the kind of instruction and the philosophy that permeates such training programs, that does account for, in part, either lack of practical and realistic considerations in the field, but also certain approaches that still equate research with a negative presumption that researchers have to overcome.